The millionaire's family mocked the black hotel maid until she grabbed the mic, revealed her $50 billion inheritance, and left them dumbfounded. The richest woman in America was scrubbing on her knees when Preston Ashworth walked in and made the biggest mistake of his life. Grace Washington had been hiding as a hotel maid for 2 years, and in 60 seconds, this black woman in a housekeeping uniform was about to reveal she was worth more than his entire bloodline, and the 500 millionaires watching had no idea they were about to witness the most savage takedown in Manhattan history. But the real shock. She could have destroyed him quietly. Instead, she chose public execution. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, allow me to take you back to where this story really began, that Tuesday morning when Grace had just 17 days left of the most challenging experiment of her life. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the towering windows of the Grand Continental Hotel's marble lobby, casting long golden rectangles across the polished floor. Grace Washington moved through these patches of light like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the cold stone. At 28, she possessed a natural elegance that her navy blue housekeeping uniform couldn't quite conceal. The way she held her shoulders straight, the gentle precision of her movements, the intelligence that flickered behind her warm brown eyes. Grace paused at the mahogany reception desk, checking her reflection in the brass nameplate that read, "Concierge Services." Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, not a strand out of place. She'd learned long ago that invisibility was survival in places like this. The wealthy guests who frequented the Grand Continental looked through service staff like they were furniture, useful when needed, forgotten when not. "Morning, Grace," called Tommy Martinez from behind the front desk, his accent thick with Brooklyn roots. At 19, he was still new enough to smile genuinely at everyone, even at this ungodly hour. "You're here early again." "Mrs. Bell in the penthouse requested fresh linens before her morning yoga," Grace replied, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she'd perfected over the past 2 years. What she didn't mention was that she'd been awake since 4, sitting by her apartment window with a cup of coffee and her grandmother's worn leather journal, reading the same pages she'd memorized months ago. True character, my dear Grace, reveals itself not in what we own, but in how we treat those who can do nothing for us. Grandmother Evelyn's handwriting flowed across the yellowed page in Grace's memory. The woman who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Grace was 12. The woman who'd built an empire from nothing and left Grace everything, with one impossible condition. Grace shook away the memory and headed toward the service elevator. The brass doors reflected her image back at her, a young black woman in a hotel uniform, pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. No one would guess that the account statements locked in her apartment safe showed a balance that would make most millionaires weep with envy. The elevator hummed softly as it climbed to the 15th floor. Grace's thoughts drifted to the letter from her grandmother's law firm that had arrived exactly 2 years ago, 3 months after the funeral. "Miss Washington, per your grandmother's final wishes, you will inherit the full estate valued at approximately $50 billion on one condition. You must spend exactly 2 years experiencing life from the perspective of those whom society overlooks. Only then will you understand the true weight of the responsibility that comes with such wealth. 2 years of scrubbing toilets, of being invisible, of watching how the wealthy treated people they considered beneath them." Grace had 17 days left. The elevator dinged softly, and Grace stepped into the carpeted hallway of the luxury suites. She loved this part of her work, the quiet moments before the world woke up, when she could move through spaces of incredible beauty without judgment or scrutiny. The Grand Continental spared no expense on these floors. Hand-painted wallpaper from France, crystal chandeliers that caught and scattered light like captured rainbows, original artwork worth more than most people's homes. Grace knocked gently on suite 1504. "Housekeeping, Mrs. Bell." "Come in, dear," came the warm voice from inside. Grace entered to find Eleanor Bell, a 73-year-old widow, already dressed in soft purple yoga clothes. Mrs. Bell had been staying at the Grand Continental for 3 months while her penthouse apartment underwent renovations, and she'd specifically requested Grace for all her housekeeping needs. "Grace, sweetheart, you're too good to me," Mrs. Bell said, her eyes crinkling with genuine affection. "I know you don't have to come this early." "It's no trouble at all, Mrs. Bell. I know you like to start your day peacefully." Grace began changing the Egyptian cotton sheets with practiced efficiency, but Mrs. Bell sat on the velvet armchair by the window and watched her with curious eyes. "You know, dear, I've been wondering about you," Mrs. Bell said softly. "You speak differently than the other housekeeping staff. More educated. And yesterday, when you helped me with my tablet, you solved that technology problem faster than my grandson could have." Grace's hand stilled for just a moment on the crisp white pillowcase. "I just pay attention, Mrs. Bell. You pick things up." Mrs. Bell tilted her head. "And your hands, they're soft for someone who's been cleaning professionally for years. Almost like—" She paused, studying Grace's face. "Like someone who's used to a different kind of work entirely." Grace forced a smile and continued her task. "I moisturize religiously. Occupational hazard, you know." Mrs. Bell didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. "Well, whatever your story is, dear, I want you to know that your kindness means more than you realize. In my 73 years, I've learned that character shows up in the smallest gestures." The words hit Grace like a gentle slap. How many times had her grandmother said something similar? "Thank you, Mrs. Bell. That means a lot coming from you." As Grace finished her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Bell saw through her carefully constructed facade. But there was warmth in the older woman's perception, not judgment. Preston Ashworth III stepped out of his Bentley Mulsanne and surveyed the gleaming Gulfstream G650 waiting on the tarmac. At 54, he cut an imposing figure in his custom-tailored Armani suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Patek Philippe watch catching the morning sun. Everything about Preston screamed old money, from his confident stride to the way he held his head like a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. "About time we got back to civilization," Preston muttered to his wife, Catherine, who emerged from the car behind him in a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 49, Catherine had the sharp beauty of a woman who'd spent decades perfecting her appearance and her social standing. "The Hamptons' house was perfectly fine, Preston," Catherine replied, though her tone suggested she agreed with her husband's assessment. "But I am looking forward to the city. The charity gala tonight should be quite the event." Their son, Bryce, 25 and already showing signs of his father's entitled swagger, scrolled through his phone without looking up. "Did you see the guest list? The Vanderbilts are coming, and the Rockefeller Foundation is presenting. This is going to be the social event of the season." "Language, Bryce," Catherine chided automatically, though she made no real effort to correct her son's arrogance. "Remember, we're representing the family name tonight." The family's youngest member, 16-year-old Charlotte, walked slightly behind the group. Unlike her relatives, Charlotte's designer clothes seemed to hang on her frame with less confidence. Her blue eyes held a different quality than her family's, something softer, more observant. "Dad, do we really have to stay at the Grand Continental again?" Charlotte asked quietly. "Couldn't we just use the penthouse apartment?" "The penthouse is being redecorated," Preston replied curtly. "Besides, the Grand Continental provides a certain atmosphere for tonight's event. The ballroom there is perfect for making the right impression. Plus," Catherine added with a sharp smile, "it's important for people like us to be seen supporting the hospitality industry. Shows we're not completely out of touch with the working class." Bryce snorted. "Right, because staying in a $1,500 a night suite really shows solidarity with the common people." "Don't be crass, darling," Catherine said, though she was smiling. "It's about optics. Appearances matter in our world." Preston nodded approvingly at his wife's wisdom. Your mother's right. Tonight's gala isn't just about charity, it's about reinforcing our position in society. The Ashworth name carries weight, and people need to remember that. As they boarded the private jet, Preston's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Suite 1847 is prepared at the Grand Continental. Full VIP treatment arranged. Gala preparations on schedule. Preston smiled with satisfaction. Everything in his world operated exactly as it should, efficiently, expensively, and with the proper deference to his status. The Ashworth family had been pillars of New York society for 4 generations, their wealth built on real estate investments, banking interests, and the kind of connections that turned millions into hundreds of millions. "Charlotte, put that book away," Catherine commanded as the plane prepared for takeoff. "We need to discuss tonight's seating arrangements and your speech for the Junior Donors Circle." Charlotte reluctantly closed her copy of Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. "Mom, I was thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, and—" "We've already prepared your remarks," Preston interrupted. "Nothing too political, nothing controversial. Just stick to the approved talking points about the importance of education and opportunity." "But Dad, don't you think we should address the actual systemic issues that—" "Charlotte." Preston's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You're 16. Your job tonight is to represent the family with grace and dignity, not to solve the world's problems with teenage idealism." Charlotte fell silent, but her fingers tightened around her book. She'd been reading more lately, asking questions that made her parents uncomfortable. Questions about privilege, about responsibility, about whether their charity work was genuine compassion or elaborate tax write-offs with social benefits. As the Gulf Stream lifted off, Preston gazed down at the Manhattan skyline growing larger in the distance. His family owned pieces of that city, buildings, businesses, influence. Tonight's gala would reinforce their standing among New York's elite, and he fully intended to use the opportunity to announce his upcoming political ambitions. "I've been thinking," Preston said to Catherine as the plane leveled off, "tonight might be the perfect time to hint at my Senate run. Get the right people talking." Catherine's eyes lit up with ambition. "The Hartwell family will be there, and Senator Morrison. If we play this correctly, we could have major endorsements lined up before Christmas." Bryce looked up from his phone. "Are you seriously thinking about politics, Dad? That sounds like a lot of work for not much payoff." "Power, son," Preston replied. "Real power comes from controlling policy, not just wealth. The Ashworth name could mean something even bigger than it already does." Charlotte listened to her family plan their ascent to even greater heights of influence and felt a familiar knot of discomfort in her stomach. She thought about the book in her lap, about the author's words on privilege and responsibility, about the vast gap between her family's stated values and their actual treatment of anyone outside their social circle. What about using that platform to actually help people? Charlotte asked quietly. The plane fell silent except for the hum of the engines. "Charlotte," Catherine said with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, "helping people is exactly what we do. The Ashworth Foundation has donated millions to worthy causes. But do we actually know if it's helping? Do we ever talk to the people we're supposedly helping?" Preston's jaw tightened. "Young lady, I think you've been reading too many of those books that fill your head with nonsense. Our family has done more for this city than most people could accomplish in 10 lifetimes. I'm just saying maybe we could. Maybe you could focus on being grateful for the opportunities you've been given," Bryce interrupted. "Not everyone gets to grow up in a family like ours." Charlotte bit back her response and returned to her book, but her mind was churning. She loved her family, but she was beginning to understand that love didn't require blind agreement with everything they did or believed. As the Gulf Stream descended toward Teterboro, Preston felt the familiar satisfaction of returning to his domain. Tonight would be perfect. The right people, the right setting, the right opportunities to advance the Ashworth legacy even further. He had no idea that in a few hours, his understanding of power, worth, and legacy would be completely destroyed by a woman in a cleaning uniform who possessed more wealth than his family had ever dreamed of, and more wisdom than they'd ever bothered to acquire. The marble lobby of the Grand Continental Hotel hummed with afternoon energy. Business executives checked their phones while waiting for cars. Tourists marveled at the hand-painted ceiling depicting scenes from Greek mythology, and hotel staff moved with practiced efficiency through the controlled chaos. Grace pushed her housekeeping cart toward the service elevator, her shift nearly complete, when the ornate brass doors of the main elevator opened with a soft chime. Preston Ashworth III emerged first, his presence commanding immediate attention from the hotel staff. He wore a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months, and his silver hair was styled with a kind of perfection that suggested a personal barber. Behind him came Catherine, draped in a burgundy Hermes coat that flowed like liquid silk, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon secured with what appeared to be genuine diamond pins. "Finally," Catherine breathed, surveying the lobby with the critical eye of someone accustomed to finding fault. "Civilization." Bryce followed, his designer sneakers squeaking slightly against the marble floor as he scrolled through his phone. "The Wi-Fi here better be better than that house in the Hamptons. I've got 3 conference calls scheduled with my investment advisor." Charlotte trailed behind, carrying a worn leather satchel that looked distinctly out of place among her family's pristine luggage. Her eyes wandered around the lobby with genuine curiosity, taking in the architecture and the diverse mix of people moving through the space. Grace had frozen near the service elevator, recognizing the family from the society pages she sometimes glimpsed in discarded newspapers. The Ashworths were old money royalty in Manhattan, their faces regularly appearing at charity galas and political fundraisers. She kept her head down and continued toward the elevator, hoping to avoid any interaction. "Excuse me," Preston's voice cut through the lobby noise like a blade. "You there, with the cart?" Grace's heart sank. She turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Preston approached with the confident stride of a man who had never been told no. "I need you to personally handle our suite. Suite 1847. My family has very specific requirements, and I want to ensure they're met precisely." "Of course, sir. I can arrange for our head of housekeeping to—" "No," Preston interrupted, his tone suggesting the very idea was offensive. "I said personally. Can you read English? Do you understand what personally means?" The lobby seemed to quiet around them. Other guests glanced over, some with curiosity, others with discomfort at Preston's increasingly aggressive tone. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks but maintained her composure. "I understand perfectly, sir. I'd be happy to take care of your suite." Catherine had approached during the exchange, her sharp blue eyes assessing Grace with unconcealed disdain. "Preston, are you sure about this? She looks—" Catherine paused, letting her gaze travel from Grace's hair to her shoes. "Adequate, I suppose, but we do have standards." "What my wife means," Preston said, though Catherine had been perfectly clear, "is that we expect exceptional service. The Ashworth family doesn't accept mediocrity from anyone, especially—" He gestured vaguely at Grace's uniform. "Service staff." Bryce had looked up from his phone, drawn by the entertainment of watching his father assert dominance. "Dad, just tell her what you need. It's not rocket science." Grace's grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Dignity, my dear Grace, is something no one can take from you unless you give it away." She straightened her shoulders imperceptibly. "I assure you, sir, that your suite will receive the same high standard of care that every guest at the Grand Continental expects." Preston's eyes narrowed. There was something in Grace's tone, too composed, too articulate, that irritated him. "Listen carefully. What's your name?" "Grace, sir." "Listen carefully, Grace. When I speak to you, I expect you to respond with appropriate deference." "Yes, sir, and—" "No, sir, are about the extent of what I need to hear from you. I don't need your assurances or your opinions about hotel standards. I need compliance. Do you understand the difference? The lobby had grown noticeably quieter. A well-dressed elderly gentleman reading a newspaper near the fireplace had lowered his paper and was watching the exchange with obvious disapproval. Two businesswomen by the concierge desk were whispering to each other, their expressions troubled. Grace's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the handle of her cart. "Yes, sir. Better." Preston's smile was cold and satisfied. "Now, I want our suite cleaned again before 5 o'clock. I don't care that it was probably already cleaned today. I want fresh everything, linens, towels, toiletries. And I want it done quickly and quietly. We have an important event tonight, and I won't tolerate any disruptions." "Of course, sir." Catherine stepped closer, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a confidential tone but was still clearly audible to everyone nearby. "Also, make sure you're presentable when you come to our floor. We may have guests visiting before the gala tonight, and first impressions matter." "What my mother means," Bryce added with a smirk, "is maybe run a comb through your hair or something. Try to look professional." Charlotte, who had been silent throughout the exchange, took a small step forward. "Mom, she looks perfectly." "Charlotte," Catherine's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "This doesn't concern you." Grace felt the familiar burning sensation behind her eyes that she'd learned to suppress years ago. Not here. Not in front of these people. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I understand completely," Grace said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "Will there be anything else?" Preston was studying her face, and Grace realized he was disappointed. He had wanted her to crack, to show anger or hurt or fear. Her composure was ruining his entertainment. "Actually, yes," Preston said, his voice taking on a different quality, harder, more deliberately cruel. "I want to be crystal clear about something. My family has been coming to establishments like this for generations. We know quality when we see it, and we know other things when we see them too." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. "People like you, and I think you know exactly what I mean by that, seem to think that working in a place like this somehow elevates your status. That wearing a uniform in a fancy hotel makes you something more than what you actually are." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "But the truth is," Preston continued, his voice growing louder, more confident as he fed off what he perceived as Grace's vulnerability, "you're still just cleaning up after your betters. You're still just the help. And no amount of fancy marble and crystal changes that fundamental reality." Catherine nodded approvingly. "Preston's right, dear. It's important to remember your place. Don't get ideas above your station just because you work somewhere nice." The lobby was now completely silent except for the soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. Grace could feel dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the spectacle unfolding before them. "The fact is," Bryce added, clearly enjoying his family's performance, "some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow. It's just the natural order of things. Nothing personal." Grace's vision seemed to narrow to a tunnel. All her years of education, all her grandmother's lessons about character and dignity, all the wealth that could buy and sell this family 10 times over, none of it mattered in this moment. She was just a black woman in a uniform being put in her place by people who believed their bank account balance determined their human worth. "Do you understand what we're telling you?" Preston asked, leaning slightly forward like a predator sensing weakness. Grace met his eyes directly for the first time in the conversation. For just a moment, Preston saw something flicker there, something that didn't quite fit with his assumptions about who she was supposed to be. "I understand perfectly," Grace said quietly. "Good," Preston smiled triumphantly. "I'm glad we've reached an understanding. Suite 1847. 5 o'clock. Don't disappoint us. The family moved toward the main elevator as if nothing had happened. Charlotte glanced back once, her face flushed with what might have been embarrassment, but she said nothing. Grace stood alone in the middle of the lobby, her hands gripping her cart so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The other guests gradually returned to their activities, but she could feel their eyes still on her, full of pity or discomfort or simple curiosity about how she would react. Tommy from the front desk appeared at her elbow. "Grace, you okay?" "That was—" "I'm fine," Grace said automatically, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "You don't have to take their suite, you know. I could arrange for someone else." "No." Grace's voice was stronger now, infused with something that surprised even her. "I'll take care of it myself." As she pushed her cart toward the service elevator, Grace's mind was spinning. 17 days. She had 17 days left of this experiment, 17 days before she could claim her inheritance and never have to endure this kind of humiliation again. But as the elevator doors closed, cutting off her view of the lobby where she'd just been systematically degraded, Grace realized something had fundamentally shifted inside her. The careful patience she'd maintained for nearly 2 years was cracking, and underneath it was something much more dangerous than anger. It was purpose. What would you do if you witnessed someone being treated this way? Sometimes the most powerful response comes from those we least expect. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Grace sat alone in the cramped staff break room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the beige walls covered with employee notices and health department regulations. She stared at her reflection in the black coffee surface, seeing not the composed woman she'd tried to be for 2 years, but someone who looked hollow, defeated. The door opened with a soft creak, and Maria Santos entered, a middle-aged woman from El Salvador who worked the evening housekeeping shift. Maria had kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of decades spent cleaning up after people who never bothered to learn her name. "I heard what happened in the lobby," Maria said quietly, settling into the plastic chair across from Grace. "Tommy told everyone. That family, they had no right." Grace looked up, surprised by the sympathy in Maria's voice. In 2 years of working here, she'd kept her relationships with co-workers professional but distant, afraid that getting too close might compromise her cover. "It's part of the job," Grace said automatically, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "No, Mija." Maria's voice was firm. "Being treated like dirt is not part of any job. I've been cleaning these rooms for 15 years, and I've seen plenty of rich people who know how to be decent human beings. What they did to you—" She shook her head. "That was something else entirely." Grace felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I just need to get through today. Clean their suite, do my job, go home." "You don't have to clean their suite," Maria said. "I could talk to Mr. Rodriguez in management. He could assign someone else." "No." Grace's response was immediate and sharp. "I said I would handle it, and I will." Maria studied Grace's face with the wisdom of someone who had seen many people try to swallow their pain. "Sometimes, mija, the strongest thing we can do is ask for help. There's no shame in it." Grace's throat tightened. If only Maria knew that Grace could buy this entire hotel chain with a single phone call, that she had more money than the Ashworth family could comprehend. But what good was all that wealth when she was trapped in this role, this experiment that suddenly felt less like her grandmother's wise teaching and more like elaborate torture? "I appreciate it, Maria. I really do. But I need to handle this myself." Maria nodded slowly, though her expression remained concerned. "Okay. But Grace, whatever those people made you feel about yourself, don't you carry that home with you. You're worth more than they could ever understand." After Maria left, Grace pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in months. Jonathan Pierce, her grandmother's former attorney and the executor of her estate. Her finger hovered over the call button. She could end this experiment right now. She could walk into that lobby in an hour wearing a designer dress and make Preston Ashworth grovel at her feet. But then what? She'd have the money, yes, but would she have earned the wisdom her grandmother had wanted her to gain? Would she truly understand the weight of responsibility that came with such wealth? Grace set the phone down without making the call. Preston Ashworth stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his suite, gazing out at Central Park while Catherine unpacked her jewelry for the evening's gala. The afternoon sun painted the autumn leaves in shades of gold and crimson, but Preston wasn't really seeing the view. He was replaying the scene in the lobby, savoring the memory of putting that presumptuous maid in her place. "You handled that beautifully downstairs," Catherine said, holding up a diamond necklace to the light. "That girl needed to learn some respect." "Did you see the way she was looking at me?" Preston asked, turning from the window. "Like she thought she was my equal or something. These people need constant reminding about the natural order of things." Bryce looked up from his laptop where he'd been checking his investment portfolio. "She was pretty composed, though. Usually they get more upset when you put them in their place." "Which just proves she's probably been getting ideas above her station," Catherine replied. "Working in a place like this, around wealthy people all day, it can give the help delusions of grandeur." Preston nodded approvingly. "Exactly. It's actually a kindness, in a way, to remind her of reality. Better she learns it from us than get some ridiculous notion that she belongs in our world." Charlotte sat in the corner of the living room, her book open in her lap, but she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. The scene in the lobby kept replaying in her mind, and each time it made her feel sicker. The way her father had spoken to that woman, Grace, like she was something less than human. The way her mother had smiled while delivering calculated cruelty. The way Bryce had joined in like it was entertainment. "Charlotte, what's wrong with you?" Catherine's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "You've been sulking ever since we arrived." "I'm not sulking," Charlotte said quietly. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" Preston demanded. Charlotte looked up at her family, her father in his expensive suit, radiating self-satisfaction, her mother arranging jewelry worth more than most people's annual salaries, her brother smirking at his phone. They were her blood, but in this moment they felt like strangers. "About that woman downstairs, Grace. About how we treated her." The suite fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. "How we treated her." Preston's voice was dangerously quiet. "We treated her like exactly what she is, hired help who needed to understand her position." "But Dad, the way you spoke to her was appropriate for the situation," Catherine interrupted. "Charlotte, you're 16 years old. You don't understand how the world works yet." "I understand enough to know that being rich doesn't give us the right to be cruel," Charlotte shot back, her voice stronger than she felt inside. Bryce laughed. "Oh, here we go. Charlotte's having another social justice moment." "It's not a moment." Charlotte stood up, her book falling to the floor. "It's basic human decency. That woman was doing her job, being polite, and you all treated her like garbage because you could." Preston's face was flushing red. "Young lady, I will not be lectured about decency by a child who has never had to work a day in her life for anything she owns." "Maybe that's the problem," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should have to work for things. Maybe we should know what it's like to be treated the way we treat other people." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers had frozen around her necklace clasp. Bryce had actually looked up from his phone, his expression a mixture of shock and amusement. "I think," Preston said very slowly, "that you need to spend some time thinking about loyalty, about family, about the difference between idealistic nonsense and the real world. The real world where we get to be horrible to people because we have money. The real world where there are consequences for disrespecting your family. Preston's voice was ice-cold now. You will apologize. Right now. Charlotte looked at her father's face, red with anger and absolute certainty in his righteousness. She looked at her mother's expression of disappointed disgust. She looked at her brother's smirk that said he was enjoying watching her get put in her place just like Grace had been. I'm sorry, Charlotte said finally. Preston nodded with satisfaction. Good. Now go to your room and think about what it means to be an Ashworth. We have a reputation to maintain, and I won't have my own daughter undermining our family's standing with liberal guilt nonsense. Charlotte picked up her book and walked toward her bedroom, but she paused at the doorway. Dad, what if we're wrong? What if treating people badly doesn't make us better? What if it just makes us terrible people with money? Charlotte. Preston's voice carried a warning that made her blood run cold. I'm going to my room, she said quickly, and disappeared behind the closed door. In her bedroom, Charlotte sat on the edge of the king-sized bed and opened her phone. She scrolled through social media posts from her private school friends, pictures of designer handbags, vacation photos from exotic locations, casual displays of wealth that her classmates wore like armor against any criticism or self-reflection. But Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about Grace's face in those final moments in the lobby. The way she'd held herself with dignity even while being systematically torn down. The intelligence in her eyes that her family had chosen not to see because acknowledging it would have complicated their narrative about who deserved respect and who didn't. Charlotte had grown up in a world where money was supposed to make everything easier, where wealth was supposed to provide not just comfort but moral clarity. Good people had money because they deserved it. Poor people were poor because they hadn't worked hard enough or made the right choices. But what if that was all a lie designed to help rich people sleep better at night? What if people like Grace, people her family dismissed as the help, were actually better human beings than the Ashworths had ever bothered to become? Charlotte looked at herself in the mirror across the room and barely recognized the person staring back. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost $800 and jeans that cost more than Grace probably made in a week. But underneath all the expensive clothes was a 16-year-old girl who was starting to understand that her family's wealth had bought them everything except the one thing that actually mattered, the ability to see other people as fully human. In a few hours, she would have to put on a designer dress and smile at her family's charity gala, surrounded by people who would celebrate their generosity while treating the servers like invisible furniture. But something had broken inside Charlotte today, something that might never be repaired. And for the first time in her privileged life, she wasn't sure that was a bad thing. Grace stood at the small mirror above the sink, checking her appearance before heading to the Ashworth suite. Her reflection looked back at her with steady eyes, but she could see the storm brewing underneath the surface calm. In 30 minutes, she would knock on their door and clean their already pristine suite. She would change sheets that didn't need changing and dust surfaces that were already spotless. She would do it with professional efficiency and polite silence, just as they expected. But something fundamental had shifted in those moments in the lobby. The careful balance she'd maintained for 2 years, between her true self and her assumed role, had been shattered by their casual cruelty. Grace Washington was no longer just playing a part in her grandmother's experiment. She was a woman who had been pushed too far, and the consequences of that push were about to reshape everything. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you couldn't stay silent anymore? Sometimes our greatest growth comes from our most difficult challenges. Share your thoughts below and hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories. 17 days had never felt so long. Grace stood outside the mahogany door of Suite 1847, her housekeeping cart positioned perfectly parallel to the wall. She had spent 3 minutes in the hallway, breathing deeply and centering herself the way her grandmother had taught her during childhood anxiety attacks. When the world feels too heavy, my dear Grace, remember that storms pass, but your character is permanent. She knocked twice, soft but audible. "Come in," came Preston's voice from inside, followed immediately by Catherine's sharp addition, "and be quick about it." We have preparations to make." Grace slid her keycard and entered the suite, immediately struck by the irony of the situation. The Ashworths' simple hotel suite was larger than most people's apartments, featuring a living room with handcrafted Italian furniture, a dining area with seating for 8, and bedroom suites that could house entire families. The afternoon sun streamed through massive windows, casting everything in golden light that made the space feel almost ethereal. Preston was standing near the wet bar, adjusting his already perfect tie while speaking into his phone. "No, Henderson, I want the Times photographer positioned near our table. This isn't just a charity event, it's a campaign launch preview." He glanced at Grace with the casual dismissal of someone acknowledging furniture. "Just ignore us and do what you need to do." Catherine emerged from the master bedroom wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent. Her hair was in rollers, and she was holding what appeared to be a seating chart for the evening's gala. "Make sure you vacuum under the furniture this time," she said to Grace without looking up. The previous girl missed several spots. Grace nodded silently and began her work, starting with the living room. She moved with practiced efficiency, dusting surfaces that were already immaculate while the family continued their preparations around her. But as she worked, she found herself genuinely listening to their conversations, not out of nosiness, but because their casual discussions were revealing the depths of their disconnect from reality. "The youth vote is going to be crucial," Preston was saying into his phone while pacing near the windows. "That's why tonight's speech needs to hit the right notes about opportunity and hard work. Americans still believe in earning what you get." Grace paused in her dusting. The irony was staggering. A man who had inherited his wealth lecturing about earning what you get, while being served by a woman who had actually built a fortune through her own family's labor and sacrifice. "Bryce, put that phone down," Catherine commanded as her son emerged from his bedroom, still scrolling through social media. "Your father is practicing his speech, and you need to review your talking points for the junior donors reception." "Mom, I've got this handled," Bryce replied, not looking up from his screen. "Besides, it's not like anyone actually cares what I think. They just want to see the Ashworth heir making the right appearances." "Appearances matter," Preston said, ending his phone call. "Everything we do tonight reflects on our family's legacy. For generations of Ashworths have built something meaningful in this city, and we're not going to let carelessness damage that." Grace continued her work, moving to the dining area where she began polishing the crystal chandelier. The family's conversation swirled around her as if she were invisible, which allowed her to observe them in a way few people ever could. What she saw was fascinating and heartbreaking in equal measure. Preston genuinely believed he was a self-made man, despite inheriting his father's real estate empire. Catherine truly thought their charity work made them humanitarian heroes, even though Grace had read enough financial reports to know their donations were primarily tax write-offs that barely dented their actual wealth. Bryce was already showing signs of the same entitled aimlessness that destroyed many second- and third-generation rich kids. But Charlotte was different. The 16-year-old emerged from her bedroom wearing a simple black dress that was elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair was styled in a way that looked effortless but probably took an hour to achieve. But what struck Grace was the expression on Charlotte's face, uncomfortable, conflicted, like someone trying to reconcile competing truths. "Charlotte, there you are," Catherine said approvingly. "You look lovely. Remember, tonight you're representing not just our family, but the future of our family's commitment to this city." "Right," Charlotte said quietly. "Our commitment." Grace moved closer to dust a side table near where Charlotte was standing, and for a moment their eyes met. Charlotte's expression was apologetic, almost pleading, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Grace gave her a small, professional nod and continued working. "Now," Preston announced, settling into one of the leather armchairs with his speech notes, "I want to practice the key moments one more time. Catherine, you'll introduce me after the auction segment. Charlotte, you'll be at the head table with the Morrison family. Their daughter is your age, and it's important that you make a good impression." What should I talk to her about? Charlotte asked. Safe topics, Catherine replied immediately. School, travel, shared acquaintances. Nothing political, nothing controversial. Remember, the Morrison family has significant influence in social circles we want to cultivate. Grace was now cleaning the windows near where Preston sat, which gave her an unobstructed view of his speech notes. She couldn't help but read the opening lines. My fellow Americans, we gather tonight not just to celebrate charity, but to reaffirm our belief that success comes to those who work hardest and dream biggest. The disconnect was so profound it was almost funny. Almost. Dad, Charlotte said hesitantly, what if someone asks about income inequality? Or about why charity is necessary when we could just pay higher taxes and fund social programs directly? The suite fell completely silent. Preston's pen stopped moving across his notes. Catherine's hands froze in the middle of adjusting her jewelry. Even Bryce looked up from his phone. Charlotte, Preston's voice was carefully controlled, what have we discussed about appropriate topics for tonight? I know, but... No buts. Catherine's tone was sharp enough to cut glass. Tonight is not the time for your social justice phase. Tonight is about representing our family with grace and dignity. Grace continued cleaning the same window, but she was now listening intently. Charlotte was clearly struggling with something deeper than teenage rebellion. I just think, Charlotte continued, her voice getting smaller but more determined, that maybe we should be prepared to answer honest questions about wealth and responsibility. Wealth and responsibility? Preston stood up, his notes falling to the floor. Charlotte, our family has donated more money to worthy causes than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. We employ hundreds of people. We pay enormous amounts in taxes. What more responsibility do you think we have? Charlotte glanced at Grace, then back at her father. Maybe the responsibility to treat people like they're actually human beings? The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Grace's hand stilled on the window, her heart racing as she realized Charlotte was referring to the lobby incident. I see, Preston said slowly. This is about this afternoon. About that maid. Her name is Grace, Charlotte said quietly. And yes, it's about how we treated her. How we always treat people who work for us. Bryce laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Charlotte, you're being ridiculous. We treat the help perfectly fine. We're not mean to them. We're not kind to them either, Charlotte shot back. We treat them like they're not even people. Like they're just things that exist to make our lives easier. Grace was now frozen in place, torn between continuing her work and fleeing the suite before this family argument escalated further. But she was also fascinated by Charlotte's courage in challenging her family's behavior. Young lady, Catherine's voice was ice-cold, you are dangerously close to embarrassing this family. Tonight, of all nights, I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect for everything your father and I have built. But what if what we've built is wrong? Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the suite, it sounded like a shout. Preston walked slowly toward his daughter, his face a mask of controlled fury. Wrong? You think our family's legacy is wrong? You think the generations of Ashworths who built the city, who created jobs, who contributed to society, you think that's wrong? I think treating people badly is wrong, yes. Grace realized she was holding her breath. This 16-year-old girl was doing something Grace hadn't managed to do in 2 years of this experiment. She was speaking truth to power, even when that power was her own family. Charlotte, Preston's voice was now deadly quiet, you will apologize to your family for this disrespect. And you will spend the evening at tonight's gala remembering what it means to be grateful for the opportunities you've been given. Do I make myself clear? Charlotte looked around the room, at her furious father, her disgusted mother, her amused brother. Finally, her eyes landed on Grace, who was still standing by the window with a cleaning cloth in her hand. "Crystal clear," Charlotte said, but her voice carried a note of defiance that suggested this conversation was far from over. Grace resumed her cleaning, but the dynamics in the room had shifted irreversibly. Charlotte had broken an unspoken family rule about maintaining the facade of their moral superiority, and the cracks in that facade were now visible to everyone, including the help who was supposed to be invisible. As Grace moved toward the bedrooms to continue her work, she realized that she was no longer just an observer in the Ashworth family drama. Somehow, without saying a word, she had become a catalyst for a reckoning that was long overdue. And in just a few hours, that reckoning was going to become very, very public. Sometimes the youngest voices speak the loudest truths. What do you think it takes for someone to stand up to their own family? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more stories about courage in unexpected places. The evening was going to be more interesting than anyone anticipated. Grace climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her modest studio apartment, her legs heavy with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. The building was old but well-maintained, filled with families who worked multiple jobs and still found time to help their neighbors. It was the kind of place the Ashworths would drive past without seeing, dismissing it as somewhere those people lived. She unlocked her door and stepped into the small space that had been her sanctuary for 2 years. The apartment was simple but warm, a Murphy bed folded against one wall, a tiny kitchenette with a bistro table for 2, and a single window that faced west toward the Hudson River. But what made the space special was what covered nearly every surface: photographs, letters, and mementos from her grandmother's extraordinary life. Grace dropped her work bag by the door and walked directly to the antique secretary desk that had belonged to her grandmother, the only piece of furniture she'd brought from her childhood home. She pulled out a brass key from around her neck and unlocked the bottom drawer, revealing stacks of documents, photograph albums, and handwritten letters tied with faded ribbon. She pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Evelyn Washington, Business Records 1952 to 2020, and spread its contents across her small dining table. Bank statements showing a progression from hundreds to thousands to millions to billions of dollars. Property deeds for buildings across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Corporate documents for companies most people had never heard of, but that formed the invisible infrastructure of New York City's economy. Grace picked up a black and white photograph from 1953, her grandmother at 23, standing in front of a run-down building in Harlem, wearing a simple dress and holding a "for sale" sign. Her expression was determined, almost fierce. On the back, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, "First property purchased with savings from working 3 jobs. The beginning of everything." Another photograph from 1967, Evelyn in a business suit, shaking hands with a white man in front of what was now a luxury apartment building on the Upper West Side. The caption read, "Convinced Mr. Peterson to sell me this building for half its value because he assumed I couldn't get financing. He was wrong about a lot of things." Grace traced her finger along the edges of these images, remembering the stories her grandmother had told during their Sunday afternoon tea sessions. How Evelyn had worked as a hotel maid during the day, a seamstress at night, and a bookkeeper on weekends, saving every penny until she could buy her first property. How she'd faced down racist landlords, discriminatory banks, and city officials who tried to block her permits, always with quiet dignity and unshakable determination. "Most people saw a black woman with a cleaning uniform," Evelyn had told Grace years ago, "and they assumed they knew everything about me. That blindness became my greatest business advantage. While they were underestimating me, I was buying their buildings and becoming their landlord." Grace pulled out her grandmother's final letter, the one that had come with the inheritance conditions. She'd read it hundreds of times, but tonight the words carried new weight. "My dearest Grace, by the time you read this, I will be gone, but my love for you and my hopes for your future remain stronger than ever. I am leaving you wealth beyond most people's imagination, but I am also leaving you a choice. You can take this money and live a comfortable life, or you can earn it by understanding what it truly means to have power over others. I spent my life building this fortune, but more importantly, I spent my life learning that wealth without wisdom is nothing more than expensive decoration. The 2 years I am asking you to spend among those our society overlooks is not punishment, it is preparation. You must understand what it feels like to be invisible before you can be trusted to see others clearly. The hotel work, specifically, is deliberate. I cleaned hotel rooms for 3 years when I was your age, and I learned more about human nature in those rooms than I did in all my subsequent years of business school. Rich people become their truest selves when they think no one important is watching. You need to see that truth before you decide what kind of wealthy person you want to become. Remember, my dear child, that every fortune carries the responsibility to lift others up. But you cannot lift anyone until you understand how far they have fallen, and you cannot understand that from the top looking down. You must climb up from the bottom yourself. I love you beyond measure, and I believe in the woman you will become. With all my devotion, Grandmother Evelyn. P.S. The combination to the safety deposit box is your birth date. Inside you will find the original deed to the Grand Continental Hotel. Yes, my dear, you already own the place where you work. Grace set the letter down with trembling hands. She had discovered that final detail only 6 months ago, during a routine review of her inheritance portfolio. Not only was she wealthy beyond imagination, but she literally owned the building where Preston Ashworth had humiliated her that afternoon. She walked to her window and looked out at the lights of Manhattan, thinking about the invisible threads of ownership and power that connected every building, every business, every life in the city. Somewhere across town, the Ashworth family was preparing for their charity gala, completely unaware that the woman they'd treated as disposable could buy and sell their entire social circle without checking her bank balance. Charlotte stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the emerald green evening gown her mother had selected for the gala. The dress was beautiful, custom-made by a designer whose waiting list was measured in years, but it felt like a costume for a play she no longer wanted to perform in. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Madison. "Can't wait to see pics from tonight. You always look amazing at these fancy events. So jealous of your life right now." Charlotte stared at the message, wondering how to explain that her amazing life felt increasingly hollow. How could she tell Madison that she'd spent the afternoon watching her family systematically destroy another human being's dignity for sport? How could she explain that the more she learned about the world beyond her privileged bubble, the more ashamed she became of her place in it? A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Her father entered, looking distinguished in his custom tuxedo. For a moment, Charlotte remembered being 7 years old and thinking he was the most important man in the world, strong, successful, someone who could fix any problem and answer any question. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Preston said, but his tone was careful, almost formal. "Are you ready for tonight?" "As ready as I can be," Charlotte replied, which wasn't really an answer. Preston sat on the edge of her bed, and for a moment he looked less like the commanding patriarch and more like a tired man in his 50s. "Charlotte, I want you to understand something about this afternoon. About what happened with that maid." Charlotte turned from the mirror to face him directly. "Her name is Grace, Dad." "Yes, Grace." Preston's jaw tightened slightly at the correction. "What I want you to understand is that maintaining proper boundaries between classes isn't cruelty, it's necessity. When you blur those lines, when you treat service staff like equals, it creates confusion and inefficiency. Or it creates human connection," Charlotte said quietly. "Human connection?" Preston's voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement. "Charlotte, these people aren't our friends. They're not our equals. They perform services for us in exchange for money. That's the extent of the relationship." Charlotte felt something break inside her chest. "Do you really believe that? Do you honestly think that being born into money makes us better human beings than Grace?" Preston stood up, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I think being born into responsibility makes us different. Our family has obligations, to our legacy, to our community, to the people who depend on the jobs and opportunities we create. We can't fulfill those obligations if we're distracted by sentimental attachments to every person we encounter. What if the obligation is to treat people with basic respect? Respect is earned, Charlotte. And it's earned through achievement, through contribution to society, through building something meaningful with your life. Preston moved toward the door, then paused. That maid, Grace, what has she built? What has she contributed? She cleans rooms and makes beds. That's not nothing, but it's not the same as what our family has accomplished. Charlotte looked at her father, really looked at him, and realized she was seeing a stranger. This man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride bikes and helped with homework and bought her everything she could ever want, was revealing a worldview so fundamentally different from her own that it felt like discovering he was from another species. "Dad," she said softly, "what if you're wrong? What if Grace has accomplished things you can't see because you've decided she's not worth knowing?" Preston's expression hardened. "Charlotte, this conversation ends now. Tonight you will represent our family with dignity and grace. You will not embarrass us with misguided liberal guilt. And tomorrow, we will discuss getting you some proper guidance to help you understand your responsibilities as an Ashworth." He left without waiting for a response, closing the door with a controlled click that somehow felt more final than a slam. Charlotte sank onto her bed, her expensive dress spreading around her like a green puddle. In a few hours, she would sit at a table full of Manhattan's elite, eating food that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, while listening to speeches about charity and civic responsibility from people who had spent the afternoon treating a hotel worker like subhuman garbage. She pulled out her phone and opened the browser, typing Grace Washington into the search bar. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe some evidence that her instincts about Grace were correct, that there was more to her story than her family assumed. The search returned thousands of results, most of them for different Grace Washingtons around the country. But one result, buried on the third page, caught her attention: a newspaper clipping from 2022 about a scholarship program funded by the Evelyn Washington Educational Foundation. Charlotte clicked on the link and found herself reading about a foundation that had provided full college scholarships to over 300 students from low-income families in New York City. The article mentioned that the foundation had been established by prominent businesswoman Evelyn Washington and was now managed by her granddaughter and heir, whose identity remains private in accordance with the family's wishes for discretion. The timing was curious. Evelyn Washington had died in 2022, which meant her granddaughter would have inherited recently. Charlotte scrolled through more articles about the foundation, finding mentions of real estate holdings, business investments, and charitable contributions that suggested wealth on a scale that rivaled her own family's fortune. A granddaughter whose identity remained private. A young woman who might be working quietly among people who didn't know her true status. Charlotte stared at her phone screen, her heart racing with the implications of what she might have discovered. If she was right, if Grace was somehow connected to this foundation, this fortune, then everything about that afternoon took on a completely different meaning. The woman her family had humiliated might be one of the most powerful people in New York City. And in less than 2 hours, they would all be in the same room for the charity gala, with no idea that the evening was about to become unforgettable for reasons none of them could imagine. Sometimes the most powerful people are hiding in plain sight. Have you ever discovered that someone you underestimated was actually extraordinary? Share your stories in the comments below. Charlotte looked at herself in the mirror one more time, but now she was seeing not just an Ashworth heir in an expensive dress, but a young woman who might be about to witness the most dramatic reversal of fortune in her family's history. And she wasn't sure whether to be terrified or thrilled. The ballroom of the Grand Continental Hotel had been transformed into a glittering showcase of Manhattan's social elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a masterpiece of white orchids and gold accents that cost more than most people's monthly rent. 500 of New York's wealthiest individuals mingled over champagne and conversation, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos creating a sea of understated luxury. Grace moved through this world like a shadow, wearing the black uniform of the catering staff she'd volunteered to help for the evening. It hadn't been required. Her housekeeping shift had officially ended hours ago, but something had compelled her to stay, to witness this display of wealth and charity from the inside. Maybe it was curiosity about how the Ashworth family would behave in their natural habitat, or maybe it was the growing certainty that her grandmother's experiment was approaching its end. She carried a silver tray of champagne flutes through the crowd, her presence invisible to the guests who took glasses without making eye contact or saying thank you. It was a masterclass in how wealth could make people believe that service was their natural right, rather than a privilege provided by other human beings. Grace Washington. The voice stopped her cold. Grace turned to see Eleanor Bell approaching, elegant in a midnight blue gown that made her silver hair shimmer like starlight. Mrs. Bell's eyes were bright with recognition and something that looked almost like pride. "Mrs. Bell," Grace said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I'm on the board of the Children's Literacy Foundation we're supporting tonight," Mrs. Bell replied, then lowered her voice. "But more importantly, what are you doing serving drinks when you should be?" She stopped herself, studying Grace's face carefully. "My dear, how long do you have left?" Grace's heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry." Mrs. Bell smiled gently. "Grace, I've been around wealthy families for 73 years. I know what old money looks like, and I know what new money behaves like. But more than that, I know what someone looks like when they're hiding in plain sight." She paused. "Your grandmother was Evelyn Washington, wasn't she?" Grace's champagne tray trembled slightly in her hands. "Mrs. Bell, Your secret is safe with me, dear. I knew Evelyn well. We served on several charity boards together over the years. Brilliant woman. Tough as nails, but with a heart the size of Manhattan." Mrs. Bell's eyes softened. "When I heard about her passing and the unusual conditions of her will, I wondered if her granddaughter might be exploring the world from a different perspective." Grace felt tears threatening and blinked them back. For 2 years, she had carried this secret alone, and now this woman, this near stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness, had seen through her carefully constructed facade with startling clarity. "She wanted me to understand," Grace whispered. "To really understand what it means to be invisible, to be overlooked, to be judged by appearance rather than character." "And have you learned what she hoped you would?" Grace thought about the afternoon's humiliation, about Preston Ashworth's casual cruelty, about Charlotte's quiet rebellion against her family's values. "More than I ever wanted to." Mrs. Bell reached out and gently touched Grace's arm. "Your grandmother would be proud of who you're becoming." "But Grace..." Sometimes the most important lesson is knowing when the teaching is complete. Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Bell melted back into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with a tray of champagne and a mind spinning with implications. The Ashworth family occupied a prime table near the front of the ballroom, positioned to be seen by everyone while maintaining easy access to the stage where Preston would deliver his speech later in the evening. Catherine looked radiant in a champagne-colored gown that caught the light with every movement, while Preston commanded attention in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, already working the room with handshakes and strategic conversations. Bryce sat scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up to nod at acquaintances or pose for society photographers. But Charlotte was distracted, her eyes scanning the room with new awareness. Every interaction she witnessed between the wealthy guests and the service staff reinforced the uncomfortable truths she'd been grappling with all day. "Charlotte, darling, you look stunning tonight," said Margaret Morrison, approaching their table with her daughter Penelope in tow. Margaret was old New York aristocracy, the kind of woman who could trace her family tree back to the Dutch colonists and never let anyone forget it. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," Charlotte replied automatically, standing to embrace the older woman. "Penelope, dear, you remember Charlotte Ashworth," Margaret continued, nudging her daughter forward. Penelope was Charlotte's age, but carried herself with the practiced poise of someone who had been attending society events since she could walk. "Of course. Charlotte, "I love what you've done with your hair," Penelope said, though her eyes were already scanning the room for more interesting conversations. "This whole event is so well done. Mother says the auction items are particularly impressive this year." Charlotte nodded politely, but her attention was drawn to a commotion near the service entrance. One of the catering staff, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Bryce, had apparently spilled champagne on an elderly gentleman's tuxedo jacket. The guest was berating the server loudly enough that nearby tables were turning to watch. "Clumsy idiot," the man was saying. "Do you have any idea how much this jacket cost? Do you have any concept of how to do your job properly?" Charlotte watched the young server's face flush with embarrassment and shame, his apologies growing more desperate as the humiliation continued. Other guests watched with expressions ranging from mild amusement to uncomfortable avoidance, but no one intervened. "Excuse me," Charlotte said suddenly, interrupting Penelope mid-sentence about her recent trip to the Hamptons. "Charlotte, where are you going?" Catherine's voice carried a warning tone. But Charlotte was already walking toward the commotion, her green dress rustling as she moved with purpose. She approached the angry guest with the same confident stride she'd inherited from her father, but channeled toward a completely different purpose. "Sir," Charlotte said, her voice clear and carrying enough authority to cut through the man's tirade, "I couldn't help but notice your jacket. Armani, isn't it? From their signature collection." The older man paused, surprised by the interruption and the recognition of his expensive clothing. "Well, yes, it is. And this incompetent boy has given you an opportunity to show grace under pressure," Charlotte continued smoothly. "I'm Charlotte Ashworth, and my family is hosting this table tonight. I'd be honored if you'd allow us to take care of cleaning your jacket. Our hotel has an excellent concierge service that can have it spotless within the hour." The man looked confused by this unexpected turn of events. Well, that's very generous, but—" "Please," Charlotte said, then turned to the young server. "What's your name?" "Miguel, miss," the young man stammered, clearly expecting more abuse. "Miguel, accidents happen to everyone. I once spilled an entire glass of red wine on a museum curator during a private gallery opening." Charlotte smiled genuinely. The difference between a mistake and a disaster is how we handle what comes next. She turned back to the older guest. "Sir, if you'd like to follow me, I can arrange for the concierge to take care of your jacket while you enjoy the rest of the evening." The man, now thoroughly disarmed by Charlotte's gracious handling of the situation, nodded slowly. "That's very kind of you, Miss Ashworth." As Charlotte led him away, she caught sight of Grace near the edge of the ballroom, holding a tray of champagne and watching the exchange with an expression of surprise and something that might have been respect. Charlotte returned to the ballroom after arranging for the gentleman's jacket to be cleaned, but instead of heading back to her family's table, she found herself drawn to the quieter areas of the room where the service staff took their brief breaks between courses. She discovered Grace standing near a service station, organizing fresh champagne glasses with the methodical precision Charlotte had noticed that afternoon in the suite. "Grace." Charlotte approached hesitantly. "I wanted to apologize for my family's behavior today. What they said to you, how they treated you, it was wrong." Grace looked up, surprised by the directness of Charlotte's words. "Miss Ashworth, you don't need to. Please, call me Charlotte. And yes, I do need to apologize. Not just for them, but for not speaking up when it happened." Charlotte's voice was quiet but determined. "I've been thinking about it all day, and I keep coming back to the same question. What kind of person does it make me if I stay silent when I see cruelty?" Grace studied Charlotte's face, seeing genuine distress and confusion there. This young woman was clearly struggling with realizations about her family and herself that would fundamentally change how she saw the world. "Charlotte," Grace said gently, "you're 16 years old. Standing up to your family takes courage that most adults never develop." "But you have that courage," Charlotte replied. "This afternoon, When my father was, when he was being horrible to you, you didn't break. You didn't fight back, but you didn't break either. How do you do that?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer without revealing too much about her true circumstances. "Someone very wise once told me that dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away. Your family tried to take mine today, but they couldn't, because I know who I am independent of what they think of me." "I wish I knew who I am," Charlotte said softly. "I used to think I did. I thought I was just a lucky girl from a good family. But today I realized that maybe my family isn't as good as I thought, and maybe luck that comes from other people's suffering isn't really luck at all." The vulnerability in Charlotte's voice touched something deep in Grace's heart. She saw in this young woman the same questioning spirit that her grandmother had nurtured in her, the willingness to examine uncomfortable truths about privilege and responsibility. "Charlotte, can I tell you something my grandmother used to say?" Grace asked. Charlotte nodded eagerly. "She said that the moment you start asking whether you're using your advantages to lift others up or put them down, you've already begun the most important journey of your life." "What journey is that?" "The journey from being accidentally good to being intentionally good." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. "Grace, can I ask you something? And please be honest with me." "Of course. Do you think people like my family can change? Do you think people who have been raised with so much privilege that they can't see other people clearly, do you think they can learn to be better?" Grace looked across the ballroom at Preston Ashworth, who was now holding court with a group of potential political donors, his charisma and confidence on full display. She thought about her grandmother's words about the responsibility that came with wealth, about the choice between using power to elevate others or to diminish them. "I think," Grace said carefully, "that change is always possible. But it requires someone to want to change more than they want to stay comfortable." Charlotte followed Grace's gaze to her father, understanding exactly what she meant. "The question," Grace continued, "is whether the discomfort of growth is worth more to you than the comfort of staying the same." At that moment, Catherine's voice cut through the ballroom noise. "Charlotte, there you are. Your father is about to speak, and you need to be at our table." Charlotte looked back at Grace, something new and determined flickering in her eyes. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." As Charlotte walked back toward her family's table, Grace realized that something fundamental had shifted. The Ashworth family's carefully maintained facade was developing cracks, and the person creating those cracks was someone they would never suspect: their own daughter, armed with nothing more dangerous than empathy and a willingness to see clearly. The evening was about to become far more interesting than anyone had planned. Sometimes the most profound connections happen between people from completely different worlds. What's the most important lesson someone unexpected has taught you? Share your story below and subscribe for more tales of unlikely bonds. In less than an hour, those cracks would become a complete rupture that would change everything. The auction portion of the evening had concluded with record-breaking donations, and now the ballroom hummed with the satisfied energy of Manhattan's elite feeling virtuous about their charitable contributions. Preston Ashworth stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the stage lights as he prepared to deliver what he intended to be a career-defining speech. The teleprompter displayed his carefully crafted words about opportunity, hard work, and the American dream, a speech designed to launch whispers about his political future. Grace stood near the back of the ballroom with the other service staff, her champagne tray long since emptied. She had been planning to leave after the auction, but something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was Mrs. Bell's words about knowing when the teaching was complete, or maybe it was the growing certainty that this evening would mark the end of her grandmother's experiment one way or another. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, his voice carrying the confident authority of a man who had never doubted his right to be heard. "We gather tonight not just as New Yorkers, but as Americans who understand that success comes to those who work hardest and dream biggest." The audience applauded politely, champagne glasses glinting in the light as hands came together in approval of this familiar narrative. My family has been part of this great city for 4 generations, Preston continued, warming to his theme. We've built businesses, created jobs, and contributed to the fabric of American society. We've done this not through luck or accident, but through dedication, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Grace watched from the shadows as Preston painted himself as a self-made success story, conveniently omitting the inherited wealth that had funded his every venture. She thought about her grandmother's actual journey from poverty to prosperity, the 3 jobs and night school and decade of saving every penny that had built their family's fortune. But tonight, Preston's voice grew more passionate, I want to talk about something beyond success. I want to talk about responsibility, about the obligation that comes with achievement. At the Ashworth table, Charlotte shifted uncomfortably in her seat. After her conversation with Grace, her father's words felt hollow, almost mocking. She glanced around the ballroom and noticed how the service staff had been positioned, visible enough to refill glasses and clear plates, invisible enough to be ignored as human beings. You see, Preston continued, there are those in our society who believe that success should be apologized for, that achievement should be diminished in the name of equality. But I believe the opposite is true. I believe that those of us who have been blessed with success have a responsibility, not to apologize for our achievements, but to use them as examples of what's possible in America. The applause was stronger now, fed by an audience that loved being told their wealth was not just deserved but virtuous. We provide jobs for those who need them. We support charities that help the less fortunate. We contribute more in taxes than most people will earn in their lifetimes. Preston's voice was building to a crescendo. And we do this not because we have to, but because we understand that with privilege comes responsibility. Grace felt her grandmother's locket grow warm against her chest, a physical reminder of the woman who had taught her that true responsibility meant understanding suffering, not just observing it from a safe distance. Which brings me to an important point, Preston continued, his voice taking on a different tone, harder, more pointed. There are those who would have us believe that our success somehow diminishes others. That wealth is a zero-sum game where one person's prosperity inevitably means another's poverty. He paused for effect, scanning the room with the confident gaze of a man making an important argument. But I reject that narrative entirely. The truth is that some people are simply better equipped for success than others. Some people understand discipline, delayed gratification, and personal responsibility. Others... He shrugged elegantly. Others make excuses. Charlotte felt her stomach drop. She knew where this was heading, and she could see several guests nodding along with approval at her father's increasingly harsh rhetoric. I was reminded of this truth just this afternoon, Preston continued, and Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what was coming. My family encountered a perfect example of this mindset right here in this very hotel. The ballroom had grown completely quiet now, sensing that Preston was building towards something significant. We interacted with a member of the hotel staff, a young woman who seemed to believe that working in an establishment like this somehow elevated her status, who carried herself with an attitude that suggested she thought she was our equal rather than our employee. Grace's hands began to tremble. He was actually going to do this. In front of 500 people, he was going to turn her into a cautionary tale for his political narrative. Now, I want to be clear, Preston said, his voice carrying false reasonableness. I have nothing against honest work. Cleaning rooms and making beds is honorable labor. But, and this is crucial, it's important that people understand their place in society's natural hierarchy. Catherine was smiling proudly at her husband's eloquence. Bryce was recording the speech on his phone, probably planning to post highlights to social media. But Charlotte was staring at her father with growing horror, finally understanding the depths of his cruelty. This young woman, this maid, needed to be reminded that wearing a uniform in a luxury hotel doesn't make you luxury. That serving wealthy people doesn't make you wealthy. That proximity to success doesn't equal success itself. The audience was completely engaged now, leaning forward to hear every word of this real-world illustration of Preston's philosophy. And you know what happened when we provided that much-needed reality check? Preston's smile was sharp and satisfied. She accepted it. Because deep down, she knew we were right. She knew her place, and she knew that no amount of attitude or aspiration could change the fundamental facts of her situation. Grace felt the walls of the ballroom closing in around her. Every face in the crowd was turned toward Preston, absorbing his narrative about her humiliation as if it were entertainment rather than the systematic destruction of another human being's dignity. "This is what real responsibility looks like," Preston continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not enabling delusions of grandeur, but providing the kind of honest feedback that helps people find appropriate paths for their lives. Not everyone can be successful, but everyone can be useful if they understand their proper role." Charlotte couldn't take it anymore. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor in the silent ballroom. Every head turned toward her, including her father's. "Charlotte, sit down," Catherine hissed, but Charlotte was beyond caring about her mother's disapproval. "Dad, stop," Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom despite being barely above a whisper. "Please just stop." Preston's smile faltered for the first time. "Charlotte, this isn't the time for—" "Yes, it is the time," Charlotte interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "It's exactly the time. You're standing up there telling 500 people that you humiliated a hotel worker this afternoon, and you're calling it responsibility." The ballroom was so quiet that the soft classical music from the speakers seemed loud by comparison. Cameras were turning toward the Ashworth table, society photographers sensing drama. "You're talking about success and hard work," Charlotte continued, her voice now carrying across the entire room, "but you inherited everything you have. You're talking about responsibility, but you've never worked a service job in your life. You're talking about knowing your place, but the only place you've ever known is the top." Preston's face was flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Charlotte, that's enough. Sit down immediately." "No." Charlotte's voice was steady now, powered by months of suppressed understanding finally breaking free. "I won't sit down while you use another human being's pain as a prop for your political ambitions." Grace watched from the back of the room, her heart pounding as this 16-year-old girl did what Grace herself had been unable to do. She spoke truth to power in front of everyone who mattered. "That woman, Grace, showed you nothing but respect and professionalism," Charlotte continued. "And you repaid her by trying to break her spirit because it made you feel powerful. That's not responsibility, Dad. That's cruelty." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Phones were out now, recording every word of Charlotte Ashworth's public rebellion against her own family. This would be on social media within minutes and in the society pages by morning. Preston abandoned his podium and walked quickly toward his daughter, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Charlotte Elizabeth Ashworth, you will stop this embarrassment immediately, or you will face consequences you cannot imagine." "Consequences?" Charlotte's voice rose to match his. What consequences could be worse than becoming the kind of person who thinks wealth gives them the right to be cruel? What consequences could be worse than losing my soul to maintain my social status? The confrontation was spiraling completely out of control. Catherine had gone pale, Bryce was staring at his sister like she'd grown a second head, and the entire ballroom was witnessing the spectacular public destruction of one of Manhattan's most prominent families. But Grace had stopped watching the family drama. Because she had just noticed something that changed everything. Margaret Morrison was approaching the microphone that Preston had abandoned, and her expression suggested she had something important to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I think we all need to take a step back and remember why we're here tonight. We're supposed to be celebrating charity and community, not whatever this has become." She paused, scanning the room with the authority of someone whose family had been New York royalty since before the Ashworths existed. "But since we're discussing responsibility and knowing one's place," Mrs. Morrison continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "perhaps Mr. Ashworth would like to explain how humiliating hotel workers fits with the values his family claims to represent." Preston stood frozen between his daughter and the podium, caught between two directions of attack he hadn't anticipated. The evening that was supposed to launch his political career was instead becoming its public execution. And in the back of the ballroom, Grace Washington realized that her moment of truth was approaching faster than she had ever expected. The Ashworth family's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, and the woman they had tried to destroy was about to decide whether to help bury them or offer them a chance at redemption. Sometimes the truth comes out in the most unexpected ways. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right when everyone else stayed silent? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage changing everything. The next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the Ashworth family, but the kind of person Grace Washington would choose to become with her newfound power. The ballroom had transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with 500 of Manhattan's most influential people serving as an unwilling jury. Preston Ashworth stood in the center of the chaos he had created, his political ambitions crumbling in real time as cameras captured every moment of his family's public meltdown. Charlotte remained standing at their table, her green dress a defiant splash of color against the sea of shocked faces surrounding her. Grace watched from the shadows near the service entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she faced the most crucial decision of her life. In her pocket, her fingers found the small brass key she always carried, the key to her grandmother's safety deposit box, where the deed to this very hotel waited alongside documents that would prove her identity beyond any doubt. Mrs. Morrison still held the microphone, her elderly voice carrying the weight of old New York authority as she continued to dismantle Preston's narrative. "Mr. Ashworth, since you've chosen to make your treatment of service workers a public talking point, perhaps you'd care to explain what gives you the right to judge another person's worth based on their uniform?" Preston's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "Mrs. Morrison, with all due respect, this is hardly the time or place for—" "On the contrary," Margaret Morrison interrupted with the steel that had made her family fortune in shipping and steel. "When a man uses a charity gala to brag about humiliating hotel staff, I'd say it's exactly the time and place to discuss character." Catherine had finally found her voice, standing to join her husband with her head held high despite the disaster unfolding around them. "Margaret, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. My husband was simply illustrating the importance of maintaining proper boundaries." "Proper boundaries?" Charlotte's voice cut through her mother's words like glass. "Mom, he didn't maintain boundaries. He destroyed a human being for entertainment." The crowd murmured with growing unrest. Grace could see phones everywhere now, live streaming the Ashworth family's public destruction to social media platforms that would spread the footage across the globe within hours. Bryce, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally stood and moved toward his sister. "Charlotte, you need to stop this right now. You're ruining everything for all of us." "Good," Charlotte replied without hesitation. "Maybe some things deserve to be ruined." Grace knew this was her moment. She could slip away quietly, let the Ashworth family tear itself apart without her involvement, and claim her inheritance in 17 days with this ugly episode behind her. Or she could step forward and reveal a truth that would change everything, not just for the Ashworths, but for everyone in this room. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "True power, my dear Grace, is not the ability to destroy your enemies. It's the ability to choose mercy when destruction would be easier." Grace began walking toward the front of the ballroom. Tommy from the front desk noticed her movement first, his eyes widening as he realized what she might be about to do. A few other hotel staff members turned to watch, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Mrs. Bell spotted Grace's approach, and her face broke into a knowing smile. She began moving through the crowd, somehow managing to create a clear path for Grace without appearing to do anything at all. Grace reached the edge of the main seating area just as Preston regained enough composure to attempt damage control. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all let this evening get away from us. Perhaps we should return to celebrating the important charitable work that brought us together." "Excuse me." Grace's voice wasn't loud, but something in its tone cut through every other sound in the ballroom. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones lowered from recording positions. Even the soft background music seemed to fade as every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the woman in the black service uniform standing at the edge of the crowd. Preston's face went white. Catherine's mouth opened in shock. Bryce looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why a member of the waitstaff was interrupting their family crisis. But Charlotte's expression transformed into something approaching hope. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger as she stepped into the space between the Ashworth table and the abandoned podium. "But I believe Mr. Ashworth has been telling a story about me, and I think it's important that you hear the rest of it." The silence in the ballroom was absolute now. Grace could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes assessing her, judging her, waiting to see what this unprecedented breach of social protocol would bring. "My name is Grace Washington," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast room. "And Mr. Ashworth is correct. I am a hotel employee. I have spent the last 2 years cleaning rooms, making beds, and being invisible to people who believe that wealth determines worth." Preston found his voice first. "This is highly inappropriate. Security should remove this person immediately." "No." Mrs. Morrison's voice was firm. "Let her speak." Grace looked directly at Preston, seeing fear flicker behind his angry facade. "Mr. Ashworth told you that I needed to learn my place, that I had ideas above my station, that proximity to success doesn't equal success itself." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. He was absolutely right about one thing: proximity to success doesn't equal success. But he was wrong about who in that lobby needed to learn their place. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. "You see," Grace continued, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a folded document, "there's something Mr. Ashworth doesn't know about the woman he chose to humiliate this afternoon." She unfolded the paper, a copy of the property deed she'd retrieved from her apartment before coming tonight. "This is the deed to the Grand Continental Hotel. And according to this document, I don't just work here. I own here." The ballroom erupted. Gasps, shouts of disbelief, the sound of champagne glasses hitting the floor as people stood up for a better view. Camera flashes exploded like lightning as photographers captured the moment that would become one of the most famous images in New York society history. Grace raised her voice above the chaos. "My grandmother, Evelyn Washington, built a $50 billion empire from nothing. She started as a hotel maid, just like I've been for the past 2 years. And when she died, she left me everything, with one condition." The crowd gradually quieted, desperate to hear every word. "She wanted me to spend 2 years experiencing life from the perspective of people like her, people whom society overlooks, undervalues, and treats as disposable. She wanted me to understand what it really means to have power over others before she trusted me with that power." Grace's eyes found Charlotte's across the room, and she saw tears streaming down the young woman's face. "So yes, Mr. Ashworth, I do know my place. My place is using the wealth my grandmother earned to lift up people like the woman you tried to tear down this afternoon. My place is remembering that dignity isn't determined by bank balance, and respect isn't something that should have to be purchased." Preston stood like a statue, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Catherine had sunk back into her chair, staring at Grace as if she were an apparition. Bryce's mouth was hanging open in complete shock. Grace turned to address the entire room now. "I want everyone here to understand something. The money you're sitting on, the clothes you're wearing, the influence you wield, none of that makes you better than the people who serve your food or clean your rooms or park your cars. It just makes you luckier. She looked back at Preston one final time. The difference between us, Mr. Ashworth, isn't that I had ideas above my station. It's that I never forgot that every person in this room, regardless of what they're wearing or what they do for work, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. The ballroom was completely silent now, 500 of the world's wealthiest people absorbing a lesson in humanity from the woman they had watched being humiliated just hours earlier. Grace folded the deed and put it back in her pocket. Mr. Ashworth, you wanted to teach me about responsibility. So let me teach you about mine. As the owner of this hotel, my first responsibility is to ensure that no guest ever treats my staff the way you treated me today. She paused, letting the words sink in. You have 24 hours to check out. The crowd exploded again, but Grace was already walking away, moving through the chaos toward the exit with the same quiet dignity she had maintained through 2 years of invisibility. Behind her, she left a room full of people who would never again assume they knew someone's worth based on their appearance, and a family whose world had just been completely transformed by the truth they had refused to see. Sometimes the people we underestimate hold the greatest power of all. What assumptions have you made about others that turned out to be completely wrong? Share your revelations in the comments and subscribe for more stories that challenge everything you think you know. The choice had been made. Now came the consequences. Grace sat at her small dining table with her grandmother's leather journal open before her, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands as morning sunlight streamed through her window. The past 12 hours felt like a lifetime. The gala, the revelation, the explosion of media attention that had followed. Her phone had been ringing non-stop since midnight, reporters and producers and lawyers all wanting a piece of the story that was already being called the billion-dollar Maid across every news platform in the country. But Grace had turned off her phone and spent the night reading her grandmother's words one more time, searching for guidance about what came next. The hardest part of wielding power, my dear Grace, is not acquiring it. It's deciding what kind of person you want to be once you have it. Wealth can make you wise, or it can make you cruel. The choice is always yours to make. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Grace wasn't expecting anyone, and she'd been careful not to give her address to the media circus that had erupted overnight. She approached the door cautiously and looked through the peephole. Charlotte Ashworth stood in the hallway, still wearing her green gala dress from the night before, but with flat shoes instead of heels, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked exhausted and very young. Grace opened the door. Charlotte, how did you find me? Tommy from the hotel, Charlotte said quietly. I asked him to help me find you. I told him I needed to apologize. Grace stepped back to let her in, studying the young woman's face. Charlotte's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was something different about her expression, clearer, more determined. You didn't need to come here, Grace said gently. You defended me last night when no one else would. I should have defended you yesterday afternoon, Charlotte replied. I should have spoken up the moment my father started being cruel. Instead, I sat there like a coward and let it happen. Grace guided Charlotte to the small sofa and sat across from her. You're 16 years old, Charlotte. Standing up to your family takes courage that most adults never develop. But you had that courage, Charlotte said. Even when you had every reason to be angry, even when you could have destroyed us completely, you chose to reveal the truth instead. You could have ruined my family, but you gave us a chance to learn instead. Grace was quiet for a moment, thinking about the choice she'd made the night before. Your family isn't ruined, Charlotte. Changed, maybe. Humbled, certainly. But not ruined. My father's political career is over, Charlotte said matter-of-factly. The videos from last night have been viewed millions of times. He's become a meme about entitled rich people. And how do you feel about that? Charlotte was silent for a long time, staring out Grace's window at the neighborhood beyond, a world her family had never bothered to see. "Relieved," she said finally. "Is that terrible?" "I'm relieved that he won't get to use his wealth and cruelty to gain political power." Grace reached out and took Charlotte's hand. "That doesn't make you terrible. That makes you wise." "Grace, can I ask you something? Why didn't you tell us who you were yesterday? When my father was being horrible to you, why didn't you just reveal that you owned the hotel?" Grace considered the question carefully. "Because I needed to understand what it felt like to be powerless. My grandmother knew that you can't truly appreciate having power until you've experienced not having it. If I had revealed my wealth the moment your father was cruel, I would have learned nothing about myself or about the world." "And what did you learn?" "That dignity doesn't come from what you own. It comes from how you treat people who can't do anything for you. That real strength isn't about winning. It's about choosing mercy when victory would be easier." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears again. "I want to be like you. I want to use whatever advantages I have to help people instead of hurting them." "Then you will," Grace said simply. "Because wanting to be better is the first step toward actually becoming better." Grace walked through the marble lobby of her hotel, seeing it with completely new eyes. Yesterday, she had been invisible here, just another uniformed worker going about her tasks. Today, she was the owner, the center of attention, the woman whose story had captivated the world overnight. But she was still wearing her housekeeping uniform. Tommy looked up from the front desk as she approached, his face breaking into a huge grin. "Grace, I can't believe, I always knew there was something special about you, but this—" He shook his head in amazement. "I'm still the same person, Tommy," Grace said warmly. "Just with a different story than anyone expected. Are you really going to kick out the Ashworth family?" Grace paused, considering the question that had been weighing on her mind all morning. "What do you think I should do?" Tommy's expression grew serious. "You know what? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. You've earned that choice." Grace nodded and walked toward the elevator, but before she could reach it, she heard her name being called. She turned to see Preston Ashworth approaching, looking like a man who had aged a decade overnight. His usual confident stride was gone, replaced by the uncertain steps of someone whose entire world had shifted beneath his feet. "Miss Washington," Preston said, stopping a few feet away from her. Might I have a word with you?" Grace studied his face, seeing none of the arrogance or cruelty that had defined their previous interactions. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth." "I wanted to apologize," Preston said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "For yesterday. For what I said to you, how I treated you. There's no excuse for my behavior." "No," Grace agreed quietly. "There isn't." Preston flinched at her directness, but continued. "I also wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For last night. For choosing to reveal the truth instead of simply destroying my family. You could have ruined us completely, and no one would have blamed you for it." Grace was quiet for a moment, watching Preston's face. "Mr. Ashworth, what do you think I should do about your hotel reservation?" Preston's shoulders sagged. "I suppose that's entirely up to you. We'll leave whenever you ask us to." "What if I asked you to stay?" Preston looked up in surprise. I don't understand. What if I asked you to stay, not as a guest, but as someone willing to learn? What if I offered you the chance to understand what it really means to serve others instead of being served?" Preston's eyes widened as he began to grasp what Grace was suggesting. "You want me to work here?" "I want you to choose," Grace said. "You can leave this hotel and go back to your old life, having learned nothing from this experience. Or you can stay and spend some time understanding what it means to be invisible, to be judged by your uniform instead of your character, to be treated as less than human by people who think wealth equals worth." Preston stared at her, clearly struggling with the implications of her offer. "You're asking me to become a hotel worker?" "I'm asking you to become a human being," Grace replied. "The question is whether you're willing to do the work that requires." Before Preston could respond, the elevator doors opened and Catherine emerged, followed by Bryce. Both looked exhausted and shaken, their usual polished appearances replaced by the disheveled confusion of people whose world had been turned upside down. Catherine approached cautiously. "Miss Washington, we wanted to apologize as well. Our behavior yesterday was inexcusable. And we understand if you want us to leave," Bryce added, his usual smugness completely absent. Grace looked at the three family members standing before her, humbled, uncertain, but still present. Still willing to face the consequences of their actions instead of running away. "I'm not going to kick you out," Grace said finally. "But I am going to offer you something that might be more challenging than leaving." She explained her proposal to the entire family, watching their faces as they processed what she was suggesting. A month working in service positions at the hotel. A month experiencing life from the perspective of the people they had treated as disposable. "If you complete the month," Grace concluded, "you'll understand something about dignity and respect that no amount of money can teach. If you don't, you'll at least know that you had the chance to become better people and chose not to take it." Charlotte stepped forward immediately. "I accept." Preston looked at his daughter, then at Grace, then back at his daughter. Slowly, he nodded. "I accept as well." Catherine hesitated longer, but eventually nodded. "If my family is doing this, then I will too." Bryce was the last to agree, but after a long moment, he also nodded. "Okay, I'll try." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt since her grandmother's death. "Then welcome to your new jobs. You start Monday morning at 6 a.m. Tommy will show you where to get your uniforms." 6 months later. Grace sat behind the mahogany desk in what was now her office, reviewing reports from the hotel's expanded scholarship program and the new Worker Dignity Initiative that had become a model for hotels across the country. The past 6 months had transformed not just the Ashworth family, but the entire culture of her business. A knock at her door interrupted her work. "Come in." Charlotte entered, wearing a simple business suit instead of a uniform. After completing her month in housekeeping, she had asked to stay on as an intern in the hotel's community outreach program. She had also convinced her private school to start a mandatory service learning program that required students to work in service positions for a semester. "Grace, the Morrisons are here for the scholarship ceremony," Charlotte said. "Are you ready?" Grace stood and straightened her jacket, designer now, but worn with the same dignity she'd maintained in her housekeeping uniform. "How are your parents doing?" Charlotte's smile was bright and genuine. "Dad actually likes working in maintenance. He says it's the first time in his life he's felt like he earned his paycheck. Mom is still struggling with housekeeping, but she's learning. And Bryce." Charlotte laughed. "Bryce discovered he's actually good at customer service." "Who knew?" Grace joined Charlotte's laughter. People are capable of surprising themselves when they're willing to try. As they walked toward the ballroom where the scholarship ceremony would take place, Grace thought about her grandmother's wisdom. The experiment was complete, the inheritance fully claimed, but more importantly, the lessons had been learned, not just by Grace, but by everyone whose life had been touched by the truth that dignity, respect, and worth could never be purchased, only earned through how we choose to treat one another. The woman in the housekeeping uniform had taught some of the wealthiest people in New York that true power came not from having everything, but from lifting others up. And in doing so, she had finally become worthy of the fortune her grandmother had left her, not because of its size, but because of the wisdom she now possessed to use it well. The most powerful transformations happen when we choose growth over comfort. What's one way you could use your advantages to lift others up? Share your commitment in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us that our humanity is our greatest wealth. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, It's the wisdom to know what really matters. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.